This is your host, Alex Mershak. I'm here talking with Jason Snyder. Jason, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
It's great to be here, man. Yeah, happy to be here.
So before I get into our topics for today, do you want to just introduce yourself once again to the new listeners who maybe hadn't heard you the last time? I know it's been a while since we last talked.
Sure. Let's see how to cut up narrativize your life. Let's see. Gosh, I don't even know where to start. Well, currently I'm living in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, and yeah, my wife and I, and we're trying to start up a homestead, and also teaching at the university. And my background, I have a PhD in applied economics, although I've kind of revolted, I would say, against the framing or the paradigm implicit in that field. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. And these days, my major interests are things like local food systems, ecological regeneration, things like localism, figuring out, how to live well within the limits of the planet. But I'm also kind of a generalist, so I'm interested in a lot of topics, interested in contemplative practice, things like that.
Right. Yeah, and like the first show we did together with your friend Jared Janes, we actually didn't cover like any of this stuff about sustainable, agriculture practices or ecosystems or anything like that. So definitely check out Jason on topics in philosophy and other more cerebral things as well. But I just wanted to get into why it is we're here today. So I was prompted to get back on in touch with you over a small, short little interaction that we had over Twitter. And I'm not going to go into the whole thread. It's relatively short. People can find it if they want. But you said, I'm not that ambitious. I'm just looking to resurrect an informal and a diversified agrarian economy with the power of fierce determination. And I responded to that, asking you some follow-up questions about what exactly you meant by that and how you saw that playing out. But do you want to just tell me a little bit about what it is that you're working on in your homesteading project, and we can go from there?
Sure. So we found a home on like 5 acres of land, and the idea really is to, starting with food, eventually, other considerations like energy, but is just to become more self-sufficient, to become more resilient, less dependent on the global supply chain. I think with, COVID was kind of, you can consider kind of a shock to the system, and overall, there was no kind of like collapse or anything like that, but it did stress, for example, global food systems. And so part of it, it's kind of a twofold thing. One is that, we're going to have a garden. We want to plant food forests, kind of all of the things that kind of permacultural homesteaders do, whether it's like raise livestock, kind of have an integrated system, but also trying to kind of build out a more robust rural economy in the area. And I would also say informal economy that, basically what that means is that, we trade goods and services that's, not taxable, not able to be monitored by the government, things of this nature. And so, that's kind of where my head's been at lately. And so it definitely influences a lot of my tweets. Yeah.
Well, so, I obviously, I see some of your updates on the homestead and the different things that you're doing around the property on Twitter. And, as someone who is just sort of generally wanting to be more independent, I admire that a lot. And I think that homesteading is going to be increasingly, it's already a movement, right? But I think it's going to be increasingly so over the next few years, especially, as you were saying, given these kinds of shocks to the system that people are starting to notice. And the fact also is that I think more and more people are recognizing the importance of decentralization in general. And the fact that when you centralize everything, one of the problems with that is that you create a single point of failure. Not to mention other problems that come along with centralization, like cascades of issues and so forth. But that's one of the biggest things that I think is interesting about the homesteading movement. But I was trying to, in my responses to your initial post there, I was really trying to get at how big are you thinking in terms of like where this could actually go, right? In terms of where it could actually end up, because I agree with you, and I think that a lot of the types of people that we interact with would all say that a lot of the systems that, especially the industrial or now post-industrial economy, have evolved around are really outdated, and the incentives that they create for individual human beings are a lot of what's causing various kinds of perversions in our society. And I don't mean just sexual perversions, although that could be the case too. And really, if we want to start developing a society for the future of humanity that actually takes our humanity into account and that gives people, a reasonable chance to live a fulfilling life and to be self-sufficient and to not be dependent on aggressive or predatory or oppressive systems that entrap them, there needs to be kind of a reimagining about the whole structure of how we're doing things. So what I'm trying to learn from you is like, how big are you thinking? What kinds of things not only are you working on maybe personally, but also are you thinking about implementing or would like to implement in the future? I know you've talked a little bit about establishing these sort of semi-independent or autonomous small villages. Do you want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps to give some context into why I'm interested in it. I think you already started and did a really good job. But in general, I see the future fraught with peril, so to speak. So I'm a little bit of a
black pill.
I'm a little well. One thing I would say to the black pill is that in order to be truly optimistic in a very grounded sense, you need to be black pilled first, and then you can feel very empowered to move forward in a very positive direction.
The only way out is through.
What's that?
I said the only way out is through.
Exactly. And so when I look at things like the climate, the upcoming climate crisis, the ecological crisis, industrial agriculture is destroying our topsoil, sending it into the ocean where it's causing problems there. There's just several. So that's just on the ecological end. I also think that we're going to have severe energy crises pretty soon. A lot of people disagree with me here, but the energy return on investment for fossil fuels is not going in a good direction. People are optimistic about nuclear, but show me the money. Let's make it happen. People have been talking about nuclear for decades. Solar is optimistic. Batteries are getting better and cheaper, and solar is getting cheaper. But this idea that it's going to replace the whole global economy with rising demand as it's going, I think is a little bit. I mean, it's possible, certainly possible, but I think that the chances of that happening are not as high as people think. And so figuring out, one, how we're going to deal with more chaotic climate, ecological degradation, undermining kind of the very basis of existence for humans and other life forms, as well as, possibly, and I would say probably, having to operate on less energy, or if it's similar amounts of energy, more decentralized, right? Like relying more on flows instead of stocks, for example. That all leads me to, okay, one, we need to become more decentralized, more rural, less urban. I'm not saying that we're all going to live in the middle of nowhere in a shack in the woods. That's not possible. But, what we had, say, in the, pre-World War II era, for example, where we had kind of small towns, rural America was much more vibrant back then. You had, these days it's very hollowed out. I think everyone's saying urbanization, urbanization, urbanization. That's the trend of the future, and it is the trend right now. But I just don't think that the complexity of urbanization, the global economic system, I just don't think it can maintain itself. And so we better start thinking in a more rural, more decentralized way pretty quickly, and also more resilient and more self-sufficient, not purely as households, but at least as communities. That's not to say that we're going to be totally self-sufficient. There's still going to be trade and all of that, but I just think that the sooner that people start moving this direction voluntarily, the softer the landing is going to be later.
Okay.
So that's kind of a context. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Well, I think that you gave me a lot to work with there, so we can go off of that a little bit. You talked about a move back towards ruralization, and obviously a lot of the forces that caused urbanization in the first place are purely economic forces. There are a lot of benefits
and
to
cheap energy. Cheap energy is a big one. Yeah.
There are a lot of benefits to living in high population density areas. Cities tend to benefit from various kinds of power laws by having more people in them. And so there is a little bit of a problem with that. But I would say that the primary difference and the reason for that transition from a more rural distributed population to an increasingly urban one has to do with the fact that in the pre-industrial economy, people's sustenance was tied to the land, right? And so you needed to own land, and most people were farmers of one kind or another, even if they were only subsistence farmers. Whereas now, obviously since the Industrial Revolution, increasingly fewer and fewer people actually need to have real physical land in order to sustain themselves. So what do you see as the key forces that could actually drive this decentralization process? I mean, people are already talking about, obviously in the era of the pandemic, they're talking about migrations out of some of the bigger population centers like New York and San Francisco. But usually the discourse around that, at least I've noticed, is not, oh, we're going to go fill up all these empty spaces. It's usually, well, we're going to move all of these professionals. The professional class is just going to exit into lower tier cities throughout the country, which I think is also good. I think it's good to have more distributed human capital. But that's not exactly the vision that you describe. So how do you see things going more rural?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing is I still think that there will be small cities, like 50 to 100,000, I think is probably necessary just given our population. And so I see it as a lot more very small rural villages, and maybe everybody lives within 30 minutes to 60 minutes from a city of 50,000. That spread out all across the United States and everywhere else. That's kind of what I see, what I want to see happen, and also what I think will happen. In terms of the power laws and stuff, I mean, you have a point there, but I think also with the internet, and now we're seeing this trend of remote work, of people collaborating online, actually physically being in a place in order to brainstorm, share ideas, innovate, I don't think is quite as necessary. So I think that offsets that a little bit. In terms of like why I think ruralization is necessary is I just think that like right now we have maybe like 2 to 5% of the population is farmers, something like that, and I just don't think that that's enough. I think that's only possible with industrial agriculture, going back to that, with really large scale monocropping. And I just don't think that's sustainable for a whole host of reasons. And so I would like to see, for example, maybe like 20% of the population at least doing some kind of agriculture on the side, right? At least doing some kind of homesteading where they're maybe self-provisioning a quarter to a half of their food source, something like that. I think, and for me, that solves a number of dilemmas. It solves the ecological dilemma because generally small farms are more diverse. Traditional farmers took care of their land a lot better. They had many different crops. They had animals, and they knew how to maintain the land, maintain fertility. I mean, traditional farmers were the OG permaculturists, basically, right? I mean, there's been a few new innovative techniques adapted, but it's really nothing new under the sun. And so it would help solve the ecological crisis associated with agriculture. So that's one. I think another, though, is, I mean, from my perspective, so, I'm really influenced by people like Wendell Berry, who, he talks a lot about kind of the meaning crisis and the crisis of specialization, where we all become so hyper specialized. And what that does is that it makes us very fragile, because we're no longer generalists in a practical sense, right? Like, we no longer, in the old time homesteaders, and maybe they also did other things. They had other crafts, but they also were homesteaders. Like, they were generalists. They knew how to do many different things. They knew how to grow food. They knew how to build things. They knew how to, they were very just good with their hands, right? And they were really tied to the earth. And I just think that there's an inherent value in that. And I think that a lot of kind of the existential crises that we see in society, a lot of the meaning crises come from being, very disconnected from the sources of our sustenance. It's all become very abstract. It's all become very, I might be a programmer, and, I'm focused on a very specific task, and everything else, I expect to work in order for me to survive, right? But what if, in the future, we do have an energy crunch, and all of a sudden supply chains break down, or, we have, multiple bread baskets around the world fail at once due to climate change, and all of a sudden, countries are hoarding food or something like that. All of a sudden, not having any generalist skills and not being tied to a place where you know your neighbors and you can help each other out and provide mutual aid to each other is really going to be a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, you saw that happening actually in a very minor way in the beginning of the pandemic, right? Where people were worried about supplies. The gun sales went through the roof. I mean, people were a little concerned there for a minute that shit might actually go down. And I think if you were living, if you're an urban person and you're living, in some large high-rise apartment building, and you don't know any of your neighbors and you don't have any yard to go in or anything like that, I mean, this situation could be quite difficult. Whereas someone that maybe is in a smaller community and has those ties, and has a really good established connection with their neighbors would be in a much better position should these sort of larger systems fail. Because a lot of what keeps, humans sort of peaceful and civilized and not so barbaric towards one another is really just based around commerce. And if the commerce systems break down, if the supply chains start breaking down, who knows what's going to happen?
Right. There's a saying that, like, anarchy is 2.5 meals away or something. Two and a half missed meals away. You pull out anarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think people should take, going to the supermarket and having plenty of food for, extremely cheap, by the way, artificially cheap. I don't think they should take that for granted. I don't think that's going to be viable in the long term, even in the middle term future.
Mm-hmm. So this point you said about specialization, I want to dig into that a little bit. There's a famous quote from, I believe it's E.O. Wilson, which is specialization is for insects.
Right. Yeah, that's a great quote.
And you said that these was it the farmers or the original generalists?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the kind of small farm homesteaders, perhaps they also did other crafts on the side. Yeah, I mean, they had to know how to do many different things related to livelihood.
Yeah, there's an interesting story of that you could find out there. There's Jeff Bezos actually is sort of the opposite of a lot of what we're talking about, but happened to be, he spent most of his childhood actually on all of his summers during his childhood on a ranch with his grandfather, and he describes how he learned how to do all kinds of things like delivering a baby calf and mending a fence and all these various kinds of chores and tasks that he had to do around the ranch. and that sort of, at least from what I've read about him, informed his I guess aptitude towards sort of just innovating and making use out of what you have, and these kinds of things like that, those sort of formative experiences.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but I was going to say, back to that quote I mentioned, you said that the farmers were the original generalists, and I was just thinking when you were saying that actually Homo sapiens are the original are the OG generalists. Out
Yeah.
of all the
No,
species, we're the most adaptable throughout our
yeah.
lifetimes. Obviously, as I'm sure you know, our brains are more modular than any other species that we know of. So. We really aren't supposed to be specialists. There are some people maybe who, for whatever reason, might be inclined towards hyper specialization. But in general, I agree with you that as somebody who doesn't want to have to specialize, that human beings are meant to be generalists. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your the thing about alienation from your labor that you mentioned there. That's sort of tied in with this. It sounded to me a little bit like Marxist theory, which is that man is a species being, and the factory work that he's forced to do by the capitalists alienates man from his labor because he can't enjoy the fruits of his labor, and he's not tied to the community that the fruits of the labor that he's producing is going out to, and doesn't have any sort of bonds between him even and his fellow workers, because of course the owners of the means of production are pitting the workers against one another. This all sounds very very Marxist, like a very Marxist critique to me. Is your view on alienation from one's labor grounded in Marxism, or is it separate from that?
Just a note, your audio and video is not synced.
Oh, is it lagging a little bit?
Off. No, that seems better.
Is it better now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right. I'll see if I can fix that later, but probably not.
Yeah, I'm not, to be honest, I'm not really steeped in Marxist theory. From what I've heard of, people, using kind of Marxist critiques of capitalism, I think a lot of it's pretty insightful, but, that's not really where my inspiration draws from. I would say I'm more of a distributionist, which is much, or a localist, and basically, so it's more of a critique, or it's more of an analysis of scale, and so it's about getting the scale right. And so if you're at the right scale, you can experiment with many different economic systems. You can have everybody, owning 3 acres and a cow, and then maybe you have a commons area that is kind of a shared resources that is jointly managed. Or you have something more communal, right? You have something like an eco village where there's, more stuff that's shared. I'm thinking, maybe like the Zapatistas in southern Mexico, right? Where that's more of a, I would say, kind of a libertarian Marxist model.
What are they doing there?
Well, basically they've taken over like a third of the state of Chiapas to basically preserve their indigenous culture. They basically rose up after NAFTA was passed in protest. Part of it was the GMO corn, because they were very concerned that the high levels of genetic diversity of their corn, highest in the world, would be corrupted. But they're also concerned about their commons land being sold off, and so they rose up in armed revolt, and basically they're still kind of at war with the Mexican government, but it's kind of a testy standoff. But they basically occupy like a third of the state of Chiapas, and the way they operate is I think they have like a little bit of land per each family to themselves, but there's a big emphasis on like public service, and so there's a big emphasis on the commons of like your obligation is to serve like on political boards or as teachers or other things for the community, as part of being in the community. And so it's kind of you can say it's kind of socialist in that way, but it's in a very decentralized way. And so you can have something more like that, right? And so for me, if you get the scale right, then some communities will be much more kind of anarcho-capitalists, and some will be much more anarcho-communists, right? And I think all of that's fine, like whatever works, whatever works for your sensibilities. I think that's good. Me personally, I'm a little bit of an introvert, so I wouldn't want to live in a commune. My parents met on a hippie commune, um, and they eventually left. So I'm a fan of families. Preferably we don't have that really now, but multi-generational families. Owning their own stuff, but the community also sharing a lot of stuff, sharing community spaces, perhaps again, kind of, common pooled resources that, that everybody kind of draws from, and, maybe some kind of informal Ostrom contract or something. But so while I resonate with some of Marxist theory, it's not where that's coming from. I'm not steeped in, it's not coming from that.
Good. So you said you're not exactly describing communes, but these are more or less informal setups. Do you imagine these communities taking root within the existing structure, right? So we're in the United States.
Right.
These would be happening within the United States. Like, you're not planning on like trying to, buy a piece of land somewhere and like, secede from some weak government or something, right?
Not
Or maybe
currently.
you don't want to reveal your full intentions.
I mean, ask me in 5 years. I think that, there are some experiments of people, like there's a big eco village kind of movement all over the world. You're familiar with Game B. Game B is all about kind of creating these little micro settlements, Dunbar level micro settlements. I would love nothing more than to be able to buy up all the land around me and invite all my friends. But
Yeah.
that's not
Joe
that's
Rogan
not
talks about that.
right. That's not within my realm of possibility right now. But even if I were able to do that, and distribute it to my friends, and maybe with the rest of it create some kind of land trust, I would still probably opt for, like, this is your space, this is your home, and we're not all sharing every single little thing, right? I think that the individual incentive or the family incentive to work your plot and to improve it because that you're going to have rights to it in the long term, I think is an important incentive. Not to say again that these more commune type setups couldn't work out. I just think that it gets very complicated very quickly. Often in the past, we've had a lot of experiments with that where they didn't work out, they broke up, just because it's very hard to organize those things, right? It's very hard to keep everybody happy. As far as succeeding from a weak government, that's not, again, that's also, I don't think, in the realm of possibility anytime soon. But I do think that one can slowly shift much of their economic activity to the informal economy. Meaning, instead of me going to the supermarket to buy bread, I barter bread with my neighbor, right? Who happens to grow wheat or something, and I happen to grow apples, right? Just a very kind of toy, simple example. Of course, it'll get a lot more kind of complicated than that, or we just pay each other under the table or something like that. But in the past, it's interesting being here in a part of Appalachia, and I've been reading up on the history of this area, and you had all of these kind of like yeoman homesteader farmers, and people emphasize that a lot. But what people might not emphasize is that there was a really strong culture of mutual aid, right? Like neighbors helped each other out, right? Like neighbors knew that they couldn't, provision everything for themselves. Like, that was just, it didn't make sense, right? Like, some people were going to make the shoes, some people, stuff like, so you started having these kind of village economies where people started to specialize a little bit, right? And I think that's great. That's why I think, to me, the idea of a village economy is more attractive than the idea of a commune.
Mm-hmm. So you're in favor of, maintaining property rights, essentially.
Personally, I don't think, again, if you have an area with the community and they want to opt for something, to me, it's a whole spectrum, right? Like, to me, it's a question of, some of the stuff you own yourself, and some of the stuff is shared in common. And it's really just a spectrum of how far on one end of the spectrum do you want to go. And I'd say if it's like 0 to 10, in terms of, 0 is property rights, 10 is communal, I'd say I'm like a 3 or a 4.
Okay. Yeah. So like the common system originated out of England because when they had very limited land, of course, you can only have a certain amount of a village dedicated to grazing, right? And so the idea is, we're going to let everyone's animals graze on the common land, and then we all benefit.
Until they enclosed all that land, of course, in order to provide, desperate people to fuel the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, the tragedy of the commons is part of solving.
Well, that's a different thing. That's a different concept altogether.
Well, no. So the tragedy of the commons comes from that problem of how do you stop? Yeah, how do you stop people from enclosing, trying to take it all for themselves? Just like with what we're doing to the ocean right now, for example.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that sense, but okay. Yeah, I mean, because I saw it more of as like a governmental, or like you had a business interest, or some kind of you had some kind of aristocrat who came in and actually send their thugs and kicked the people off the land. I understand the tragedy of the commons is you have a community that is managing the common resources, and they don't have the right protocols or norms of trust, and people get greedy and start taking more. But I guess it's a kind of a similar dynamic. But I'd always had those two ideas kind of in separate categories. So that's interesting that you said that.
But what you're actually talking about here, I mean, you're not a totalitarian, right? So you think that people should be able to set these communities up how they want, and if they want to be more communist, they can be, or more capitalist. It's fine, whatever works. But really, what we're talking about in terms of creating a more sustainable, I mean, in terms of having like a genuine impact, right? We're not talking about just recycle your plastic, and it's going to save the planet, right?
Right. Plastic straws.
What we need to be doing is we're trying to scale up the scaling down. And how do you actually see that generating into a real movement? I mean, obviously you're not going to have a bunch of like marketing and propaganda behind that. Is it more like we're going to encourage people to create these little communities for themselves, do them as experiments, and if they're experiments that work, then people will like them, and that will, by example, attract other people into them. Sort of like, I'm just thinking right now that there's all these old tales about white settlers who went in and for various reasons, either because they were captured or they ran away or something. Sometimes they were convicts who went and joined Native American tribes. And the common narrative, when you look at all of these stories throughout history, is that there's almost no examples of a Native American defecting from their home and joining the white settlers. On the other hand, almost all of the white settlers who defected from civilized society and went and joined these native tribes ended up staying by choice. Some of them, they weren't originally there voluntarily, but they chose to eventually. And in fact, there's even one case I know of a woman who was captured by a native tribe, lived there, I think, for like 10 years, and then was repatriated by the white settlers. And then when she came back into normal society, she said, no, I want to go back. And that's, to me, it is similar to how I imagining this playing out, in obviously without all the war brides and things like that. But how I imagining this playing out in terms of, the conversion process. How do you see turning this into sort of a mass cultural movement? Or maybe that's not the goal. Maybe I'm misconstruing it. You could tell me.
Well, I mean, so I see that, I think that given the status quo, this movement is only going to have a marginal impact. I do think that more people are getting interested in homesteading recently, especially with COVID and being cooped up in apartments and feeling scared and fragile and feeling like disconnected from nature. And I think that there's just kind of a general interest, and I've just noticed that myself over Twitter. Maybe it's a bad maybe it's not a great sample or whatever, but I think it's a very attractive lifestyle. I think to go from like a full kind of the normal status quo to like a full village economy, like that's a broad spectrum, right? And so, and you would have to get there in steps. So like there might be somebody who can work remotely, moves to the country, starts a little homestead. Their income still comes from their work. I mean, my income comes from the university, right? So, I'm only baby steps, along this trajectory, and just kind of enjoying the fresh air, enjoying the nature, enjoying being able to eat eggs from your own chickens and eat tomato. I just think it's a very attractive lifestyle. Getting outside, physical labor. You don't need a gym membership anymore. You don't need to waste your energy on powering machines that don't go anywhere, right? It's very attractive. So that's one. I think people are just generally getting more interested. But two, I think it'll be seen more and more as we move forward as a necessity. I just think that, again, for a number of reasons that I mentioned earlier, I don't see our current society and economic system as sustainable. I think that, I don't see there being kind of a collapse all at once to like overnight, like the Twin Towers collapsing. Like, when people hear the word collapse, that's what they think of. But I think it'll be more like a punctuated decline, where things just keep getting worse and worse, especially in the cities. And I think the awareness of this as a better alternative will rise as more shocks to the system take place. That's, I could be wrong, right? But for me, even if I am wrong, I really enjoy this lifestyle. I don't think I've ever been happier in my life, right? And so I would do this either way. But
for how long have you been doing this?
We're still in our first year. I mean, we're kind of brand new. I mean, we're learning everything as we go. Like, we knew a little bit of gardening, my wife more than me. I didn't know how to do shit. I didn't know how to build shit. We built a chicken coop earlier this year. That was like a revelation. I was like, what else can I build, right? Like, we can build this. What else can I build?
Did you have to convince her?
I'm digging pond right now. What's that?
I was just asking, did you have to convince her, or was she already on board?
We were looking for houses, and I was like, what if we got a place with some land? In that time I had been like influenced by people in kind of the regeneration scene, like Joe Brewer, but also the localist scene, like Joe Norman. And I was like, I'd like to get some land, and I didn't think it was going to happen. Like we almost closed on some houses that didn't have as much land. And then finally we were like, hey, what about that one place we saw a while back that had a lot of land? And at first she didn't like it because it seemed too exposed to the highway. But, we went back to her and it's like, yeah, like, and all of a sudden it's just like the whole vision, just like, we can do so much stuff on this land because it's, it's not that much, we're on 5 acres, but, we like, wow, like, and then it just all started flooding. I started reading permaculture books. I started, just reading a lot of kind of the history of the region, the way people used to do things. So it's really, even when we talked last, I don't think we had closed on this place yet. And so it was really, not till after that this whole kind of, vision kind of sunk into place. And then it started clicking in terms of like, me thinking about my academic training and thinking about, how a lot of kind of the paradigm behind it is bullshit, and, reading alternative literature, and here I am today, right?
Yeah. So, where do I want to go with this? So you've got this plot of land, and I'm sure you're learning a ton working with it for the first time and building out, the sort of, I almost view it as like a prototype, right? For something much larger that might come later. But you're gaining these skills. You're saying that you're more fulfilled than you've ever been before. It's honestly like really appealing. As somebody who lives in I'm not in an urban area, but I certainly don't have anything like that going on. Although I
used to live in Lansing.
Yeah. Although I did live a little bit outside of this area growing up, and on like, I don't know, 4 acres maybe, a little bit less than 5. So I have some idea about how much land you're working with. And definitely when I get some more money, which hopefully that'll be this year, I'd like to get some land at some point and move out. And in fact, I even talked to you at one point about not talk to you, but you mentioned come out to the East Coast, come hang. And whenever I decide to make my next move, it'll certainly be something that I'm keeping in mind. But let's get into a little bit about your, I guess, economics training, and what are some of the problems that you notice with the field?
Yeah, so I mean, my training was in applied economics, and I focused on like food systems development in East and Southern Africa. And the paradigm there was this idea of structural transformation, which is basically, we need to support small scale agriculture, not as an end in itself, but because we need to eventually facilitate people basically moving out of kind of small scale subsistence farming and moving towards more of like the formal economy, moving to the cities or just larger villages or something like that. And part of, so there's kind of this implicit assumption that, modernization and industrialization, as we've seen in the West, is inherently good, right? Like that's just kind of the default assumption, and that's what development practitioners, from USAID to Bill Gates Foundation, like that's what they're all pushing, right? And part of how they're trying to do that is like, okay, we need to get farmers to, adopt technology. I don't know how many papers and seminars there are on getting farmers to adopt technology. What does that usually mean? It means adopting fertilizers. Abandoning kind of their more traditional, what I would say more agroecological practices that, are better for the land and also more resilient. It doesn't necessarily produce as much, but is more resilient, better for the land. Or bigger machinery, taking out, and that involves getting into debt, taking out loans. It's more risky, and a lot of farmers just don't want to do it, right? And a lot of farmers try it, they give it up after 1 year, and this perplexes all of the developmental experts. Like, why don't these farmers just, do what we tell them to do? And part of a lot of my research was more on the urban side, like urban food systems. And I studied like small scale businesses, like food processors and stuff, and how they can improve their business and stuff. And that was fine, but I just, I think some of the assumptions underlying this whole paradigm, one is that, moving towards the industrial food system, with packaged foods, with all of these chemical inputs, petrochemical inputs, is inherently the direction we need to go. And, as I've been reading more and more on kind of like the peak oil literature or, the climate ecological crisis literature, I just started realizing that, I think we're setting people up for failure in the long term by doing that. We've already kind of set ourselves up for failure here in the United States. Now we're exporting that model to the rest of the world. So yeah, I think that's my major gripe is, is trying to get farmers to basically to specialize almost all the energy in cash crops, which they can then, use to, buy goods and services outside of the kind of the rural farm economy. And, again, essentially become more specialized and dependent on the global system with, being more at the mercy of commodity prices, all of this stuff that, I just think that it was the wrong direction for us, then it's the wrong direction to be pushing on other people.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that in general, that characterization of it. From what I understand about, I mean, I know more about it from like the foreign aid perspective, but I mean, it is really a kind of imperialism, right? That we're exporting, right? And you're correct that we are sort of also modeling it almost really in an outdated way. We're modeling it based on the transformation that we saw ourselves go through. The industrialized economies, they went through that particular process, and they're basically choosing to try to incentivize or force these underdeveloped economies into following that same exact path, when in fact maybe they could be skipping a few steps and actually just going right to a more sustainable type of arrangement. I think that's what you're trying to get at a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm definitely, I'm not, and I don't want people to think that I'm like anti-technology or like I definitely think that there are paths of development that are more sustainable, more resilient, all of this stuff, and I figured we might get into this, this idea of cosmo-localism, of localized manufacturing, solar, decentralized solar technology, like all of these things that are pretty high tech. Some of it's low tech, some of it's high tech. All of these can be really good things, and these are technologies that can actually perhaps be useful to some of these quote underdeveloped rural economies, in terms of just raising their standard of living a little bit, right? So I think that's good. And so yeah, I mean, what you said about leapfrogging, that might be the case, right? Like we might, they've already done that with cell, with phone technology, right? Like they're not putting up landlines because they went right to cellular service, and parts of Africa are now innovating faster than anywhere else in the world in terms of like payments and just various different services you have on your phone, weather information, market information, all of this stuff, is like Kenya is like kind of a one of the global innovators in the space, right? Yeah. And so some of this stuff I think can be good. I'm not a categorical Luddite, so to speak, but I think that when we innovate, when we adopt technology, we always have to ask, like, what are we doing this for, right? Like, what is this appropriate to living well within the limits of the earth in a sustainable, resilient way or not? And I think a lot of technologies are not like that.
So that's a paradigm that I'm really sympathetic to, and unfortunately, I think that the U.S. is we all know the U.S. isn't the only player in that game who's trying to influence these economies and these locales. China. Other European countries are doing it. China is doing it on an insane scale in Africa. They might own all of Africa by the end of the century. And a lot of their way that they're doing is through financial leverage, putting people into debt traps, and then you're working for them. And so in some sense, there's a certain amount of tragedy to it, because I think that from the United States, just from a pure foreign policy perspective, we view it almost like, well, we're the existing hegemon, and China is this up and coming wannabe hegemon. And so if we don't do it, then they're going to. And I think one of the harder things is going to be figuring out how to not be so paternalistic, for one, but also not turn this into a zero-sum game dynamic where it's these other countries and these other people that are suffering, so that we can, jockey for position.
Right. So yeah, I mean, in Game B they talk about like multipolar, traps and all of this stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think China is going to face a lot of the same challenges that that we've talked about. Again, I think that there's going to be again, energy I think is just not emphasized enough, right? Like solar is very promising, but all of the materials that go into solar, all of the raw materials, lithium, what else? It's slipping my mind, but all of these things need to be extracted. These are rare earth minerals.
Yes.
The energy that goes into actually making the solar panels, distributing them, like all of this stuff, and as well as battery technology, right? Like
Tesla, buy Tesla.
Yeah, I mean, battery technology is getting better, but I'm not sure if I'm still skeptical, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm skeptical that in 10 years, if we stopped using all fossil fuels, renewable energy, and let's take nuclear out of this because that's a wild card. But if we take nuclear out of this, that renewable energy would be able to power the global economy as we see it today. Like that seems very far-fetched to me. And so I think, if there's these challenges, of, of land degradation, topsoil loss, where, crops, you keep piling, chemical fertilizers on them, and, the crops just aren't responding like they used to. You start getting these major kind of, like these major shocks to the system. Like, I think China is going to be in the same boat that we are, right? And so in terms of like, oh, we need to gear up. I mean, we're kind of in an economic Cold War, right? Like that's kind of the mentality. Whereas like when we were facing off against the Soviet Union, we had to invest in all this, technology, rocket technology, in order to beat the Soviets. And now it seems like, I think a danger is that we're doing the same thing with China, and we're all just kind of running off of a cliff.
Together. We'll both go down together.
Hand in hand.
Yeah. So let's get into technology a little bit, because I think one of the stronger critiques against these kinds of visions, and I don't get the sense that you're really a sort of a hippy dippy idealist about any of this. But one of the stronger critiques is that you can't do high-end manufacturing, right? And you need things like, airplanes and jet engines and medicines, and you need to be able to do science, which takes often very complex equipment that is not feasible to produce on a small scale. How do you account for, the technical capacity that's required to keep this kind of modernized economy going? I mean, we're both using computers, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to make that it's very unlikely you're going to make that on any kind of small scale. And you do need a certain level of global supply chain in order to source all the materials, because the materials aren't located in one place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, I'll just say right off the bat is I think we consume way too much and we waste way too much, right? So, I'm definitely a degrowther, right? I think that this obsession with GDP growth is very mistaken. I mean, we're kind of trapped in it with these debt cycles, but we're not building stuff to last. All of this stuff. So I think we need to consume much less stuff. In terms of the stuff we like to keep, computer technology, modern medicine, I agree with you. Like, some of this stuff is going to require some scale, and it's going to require trade. I do think that a lot of the manufacturing can be relocalized, at least to like large scale regional levels, while still trading in, the raw material, the raw material resources, necessary to make them work. And I think, part of what that makes that possible is the technology, is the digital technology, right? Like the fact that we can open source designs for things like 3D printers, but, not just 3D printing. The fact there's this movement called open source technology, which, they're basically trying to create basically a civilizational toolkit that can be made locally, based on kind of these open source designs and local materials. Not always local materials, sometimes traded, but and so I do think that we're going to need some scale for some things, right? Part of localism is minimum viable scale, right? And so if certain, machine technologies, certain, equipment that you need to make the medicines, needs to be more centralized, then so be it, right? But there's a lot of things, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think can easily be more localized. Food is one of them. I mean, food is kind of like my major, and food systems is kind of like my major obsession. And so that's what I'm really focused on. But I think a lot of manufacturing can as well.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think that, how do I say this? I think that it's unclear to me how much you can do with certain things like 3D printers, for example, just because they're kind of limited by like the materials that you can use. But obviously, I agree with all of this stuff about open sourcing technology. And in fact, I had one of my earliest episodes was with Jason Snyder, or not. That's your name.
That's my
Well,
name.
that's also true. This is a different Jason. I'm blanking on his first name right now. I Jason, who runs the blog Roots of Progress. I'm blanking on his last name for some reason, but he runs the blog Roots of Progress, which is basically they've got a nice hefty grant, and what he's doing with that is he's basically outlining or creating it's more like an encyclopedia of he calls it like bootstrapping civilization, right? So he's exploring things like materials, basic chemistry, like how's concrete made, like what are locomotives about, and basically the idea with that is try to document all these vast accomplishments that really most of them we've made in like the last few hundred years, so that in the worst case scenario where you have to like break the glass and try to start over civilization on some small scale, that there'll be something there in terms of at least information to get people going again, because there is this real fear of loss. And even just from generation to generation, like I'm sure the kinds of factories that we were building that the 19th century industrialists were building probably couldn't be built today. And maybe there's been a lot of improvements on the process and various kinds of automation and things like that, but I'm sure there's been just loss of generational knowledge. And so that's something that we do need to figure out how to preserve. Obviously, digitization and the internet is going to be a big part of that. Speaking of the internet, one of the things that I wanted to get into with you that's related to all of this and is sort of attacking it on the economic front and is a way to get away from some of these centralized institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank, et cetera, is cryptocurrency. Do you have an interest in cryptocurrency, and have you thought about, alternatives for, decentralized finance, DeFi, fitting into these schemes, especially sort of the economies that you're talking about? Like,
I mean, I'm certainly interested. Honestly, it's not my area of specialty at all. So I listen to podcasts about it and stuff. I don't actually own any crypto right now. I'm thinking about it. I'd rather put my money in land projects. I'd rather buy fruit and nut trees than buy Bitcoin at this point. Maybe that's a mistake. I don't know. From what I've heard, like in terms of what seems really interesting to me, I don't know if you've heard of like holochain. It's kind of they talk about it kind of as an alternative to the blockchain. It's more peer-to-peer. There's no kind of centralized ledger, and it's more kind of adaptable to like what communities want and need on kind of a decentralized scale. And so kind of that direction of alternative currencies, crypto, I'm very interested in. I definitely think it can and should play a role. I just I won't be the one leading that effort just because I don't know that much about it. But I think it's very promising. I also think that some stuff in the crypto space kind of seems like a scam or a pyramid scheme or just kind of a speculative whatever. But I do think that there's real value that's coming out of it and is going to come out of it. I don't think we've really realized that value yet.
I totally agree. I mean, it is the wild, wild west out there. So there's going to be people coming and trying to take advantage of people, and there's going to be vaporwave type phenomenon going on. But in general, I do think that we're getting to the point where it's obviously the big names. You've got Bitcoin, you've got Ethereum, you've got Litecoin. Those are all very well established. They have very well organized open source development teams, and people can generally trust that those are at least going to be around for a while. They may not win out in the end. I don't know which one is going to reign supreme, but I agree with you that like there's a lot of untapped possibility there in terms of different ways of organizing payment systems and transactions and ownership, all kinds of things like that. I haven't looked into holochain specifically, so I can't really talk about that. But I'm very excited about, for example, the Ethereum protocol, and what you can do with smart contracts, especially in the realm of governance and politics, because governance is really just a bunch of contracts put together. And so you can really just, like, the Constitution, in my opinion, could just be a bunch of code. And it effectively is that. It's just in paper, in English.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think, in order for my vision to be realized, I think, you're still going to need higher level governance. And so how are you going to have, many kind of bioregional local economies? Like, they're still going to need to trade with each other. They're still going to need to interact. I mean, they're still going to be, wannabe warlords, and there's still going to be kind of people vying for power.
South Appalachian Autonomous Zone.
That, I mean, that I'm trying to convince all my friends to move here to Southern Appalachia, and we're gonna, we're basically gonna form an empire.
They're gonna elect you mayor, and then.
I mean, we'll see, right? We'll see. Whoever's the most worthy.
Make your buddy the sheriff. Just run a little town.
I mean, hopefully it's hopefully it's not clientistic or all of that stuff. But I do think we're going to need this higher level collective intelligence as a global system to make it all work, because there's going to be a lot of international issues still. Like, for example, climate change. Even if we stopped emissions today, it's just going to get worse. It's already baked in, and there's going to be millions of climate refugees, right? Like, that's a global problem, right? Like, and I think that's something that I would like to see all of us come together to sort out, right? And figure out how to fit people in here and there, and if where they live is no longer viable, because of things like flooding, right? Like they're Bangladesh, for example, is not looking good, right? Like there's predictions that millions and millions of people are going to be displaced in the next few decades in Bangladesh. And so we're going to need these higher levels of intelligence to be able to still operate, as a global system and have emergent governance at the appropriate scale, at the minimum viable scale, right? So it's still a localist vision, recognizing that sometimes the minimum viable scale is global. And to do that in a decentralized way, you need collective intelligence, and to have collective intelligence, you need these kind of technologies that we're talking about. And so, I'm definitely, I definitely am kind of, I'm not like following it closely, but I'm following it kind of like, kind of a side eye follow, like, just kind of keeping up enough just so I have a general sense of what's going on out there. But I think it's important.
Yeah. And I wanted to just sort of, as we're kind of wrapping this up here, because it's just getting late, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this concept of permaculture, which we've been sort of talking about in, I guess, more specific terms around things like homesteading and issues with monocropping and things like that. But how do you think about permaculture? Because I know that you have expertise in this area.
I mean, a year's worth of.
Yeah. Well, I just meant with like the food sustainability and so forth.
Yeah.
And what are some things that people can actually start doing? For example, people who might be listening to this, to start to implement some of these, on a small scale in their own lives, some of these principles of more sustainable living.
Right. So, I mean, permaculture is a set of design principles. So it's a set of design principles basically with the idea that you're trying to kind of maximize this kind of the synergetic effects among the elements of the system to produce not the yield of, say, one crop, but kind of like the total overall kind of like both ecological and human health. And so that includes, it's all, it's not just applied to food, it's also applied to energy. It's like, thinking about like passive solar and how, your energy capture relates to the stuff you're growing and also relates to community life. So it can get very broad, and there's a set of like 12 principles. There's other things like zones and, all of this stuff. But, in terms of like, how people can at a very basic level think about applying it, it's, another aspect of it is kind of this closed loop system. Like can you eventually over time minimize the amount of inputs that need to go in the system? And can you recycle the outputs, right? So instead of, instead of thinking of it as like you constantly need to have inputs coming from the outside into your system, say it's a homestead system or an eco village, and you're producing all of this waste that needs to be carted out, can you over time recycle that waste into fertility and minimize the inputs, right? So that's, I think, a very key takeaway. And so, a very simple example of that is composting, right? So if somebody wants to, start moving in this direction, and you live in an apartment complex in the city, get a tomato plant, right? Or, get some potted plants, right? If you have a little bit of space, start a compost, right? People get, if you want to go really kind of extreme, like people talk about, eventually we'll need to figure out much better ways to recycle human waste, back into the fertility of the land and things like this. But one thing about permaculture, I would say, with regards to urbanization, is that it's very hard as a very dense city, say New York City, to like it's just very hard to live by or operate by permaculture principles in a city like that. The amount of inputs that have to come into that city every day, the amount of waste that goes out of that city every day, it's very hard to recycle in a concrete jungle, right? But yeah, so I think, if there's any takeaway, it's start growing stuff, even if it's potted vegetables, herbs, stuff like that, and start thinking about where you get your water. Can you capture your water instead of getting it from the town supply, or even a well or something like that? Can you I think just basic things like thrift. Like can you maintain a good standard of living using less? Can you fix things that break instead of buying a new thing? I think that's where I would start. But it's a whole world out there. And if you have a piece of land, there's a whole other conversation we can get into.
Right. So maybe we don't want to get into that right now, but yeah, and it is going to take some amount of effort on your part in order to really implement this, right? Even just getting a piece of land is getting harder and harder, depending on where you are in the country and what your living situation is. But
I mean, I also think that's the problem. I think the price of land is very high. It is very hard. It is very hard to achieve this homestead vision. I mean, I also think we need a new Homestead Act, right? Like, I mean, I would Homestead Act? What's that?
What was that? What's that legislation?
The original Homestead Act, I think it was like after the Civil War, and it basically, basically the government, allowed kind of aspiring homesteaders basically an allotment of land that they could own, for free or very cheap, basically where they could set up a homesteading lifestyle. And today it would be much harder because all of that land is already owned. It's owned by large scale farmers. It's owned by speculators. It's owned by people, investors, and to me that's a big problem. And so I'm not. Like the policy discussion on how to do that is a whole discussion, and you can talk about incentives, or you can talk about something that's more kind of like, hardcore land reform. That's a discussion that people can have differences of opinion over. But so that's kind of an aside. That I recognize that it is hard to get land, and the most viable way for people to do that might be to go in together. Get like 5 of your friends and and your wives or husbands together and buy a bunch of land, and you can have it more communal or less communal, build different residences or more communal thing, and go in on it together. I think that might be, for a lot of people, the most viable way to do that. I feel like I've kind of gotten us off track. Did I get us off track?
No, I think we're right on track where we were. Well, that's really awesome, and I think that that's gonna about sum it up tonight, just because cool. I'm getting a little bit tired here. And so I hope you all got some enjoyed this conversation here with Jason. I had a great time. and got some good tips on how you might start implementing some of these ideas in your own life. And Jason, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I loved having you on.
Yeah, man. Alex, anytime, man. I really enjoy these conversations. Thank you.
Cool. See you later.
Cool. Take care.